least to me, for across the papers, was this idea, okay, so we're playing with this idea of rule changing, but we can also ask, well, whose rules? You know, because I think a lot of your papers set up, there are different sets of rules being created and then are at play or in dialogue with one another. I think this is a point you made, Elizabeth, in relation to linking to Denise's paper, but then I saw that theme come up again and again, whether it's rules of use, but then also just, you know, rules of the borders and creating this line between these, you know, different systems, perhaps different companies making and painting the different yellows. So I don't know if anybody wanted to jump on that. Or, yeah, whose rules, if that got in your way. Or I can just leave it. Leave it out there in this world.
I guess for me, in the end, it's not so much whose rules, but the impossibility of the perfect execution of any rule. So for me, it's really about the difference between a formal commitment and then how it gets enacted, that there's always some slippage in there. And so it's less about who writes the rules and whose code is in place. So I think it's unruliness all the way down. And I think that's I think for me, that's the kind of optimistic moment. And a lot of the a lot of disagreements I have with my colleagues are often that they would like to keep the focus on whose rules, other people's rules, the people who are left out, who are contesting the assembly or whatever, and that any attention to the kind of official rules, the state, is automatically a compromised position. And I think that that's like way too narrow a conception of the benefits of unruliness.
Yeah, maybe the first to disobey the rules are those who impose them, who try to impose them. And one of the conclusions in our class on borders was actually I think that the border are impossible really to implement fully. Even if you want to put a border, it's almost impossible to make it complete. It's constantly a work in progress.
Right.
And I think to relate back to the project I spoke about, sometimes the rule makers, and we've probably all seen examples of this, they make a rule with the intention, for example, the potlatch ban. That was a rule that some would argue Canada made because they wanted to discipline people's behavior, because they were trying to implement, you know, they needed the indigenous labor to fuel these growing wage labor industrial economies because there wasn't settlement yet. And so this idea of accumulating wealth to give it away seemed to them at odds with capitalism. But when in fact people were participating in wage labor so they could accumulate wealth to give it away, and when you take away that, it actually undermines the intention of that rule. And so the, you know, interesting kind of contradictions.
I would add to that too, because there's also this process that's happening about rule articulation that depends on norms that may or may not be made explicit in any given time. And with the case that I work on, the norms are explicited some of the times, implicit some of the times, but then the norms are themselves maybe being challenged by the rule, right? So if the rule in my case is to get folks to be together in particular ways, in particular spaces, but the norm doesn't fit with what's underlying that articulation of the rule, then the norm has the power to kind of force a rewriting of the rule, which then manifests in these spaces.
And to pick up on that one step further, something that's interested me a lot throughout this is this assumption of what is normal and then what is not normal also, because there's how do we come up with our idea of what a rule is? Well, almost always it's informed by some kind of an idea of normalcy, and the rule is supposed to enforce the normalcy. But again, going back to all your good points, who chooses what's normal from the very start too?
State in France and the determination of how housing was to be configured. And you also made the point in relation to that the dwelling quality was determined by elites. Who else informed these decisions about the regulations on mass housing if architects were really secondary in the conversation?
Right. So, interestingly, it changes over time, right? So the architects who had been working in the 1920s and 1930s on questions of mass housing, influenced by Bauhaus, they have the ear of the housing ministry when it's created in 1946. But then the kind of technical services become more and more powerful as the trend and desire to industrialize construction. So it's really engineers who become more involved in the decision-making process, and social workers, interestingly. Social workers are supposed to be able to report about how people live and how people like to live. But sometimes when they report these to the elites, they say, well, our desire is to create modern citizenry. So you're telling us how people live, but some people live in these ways that aren't particularly modern, so we're just going to get rid of that and stick with what we think is in a more evolved way of living. So the experts change over time. Something I didn't have time to address, but urban sociologists take the place of the social workers as the 1950s and 60s progress. So who's at that table tends to be the housing officials who had been there, quite frankly, since the late 1930s, early 40s, and think they have a pretty good handle on the subject, along with social workers in the beginning, and then urban sociologists to report back, if you will.
Thank you. Hi, Denise. So I was really struck by these really interesting products that you showed us, the textiles, and I'm interested in the various ways in which people are making rights claims about or through them. Right. So the one that you mentioned at the end is the way in which they become subject to state-sponsored censorship and limitations. Right? You can't say these things. And I guess I'm interested in how you see that relating to some of the things you started with more as preamble about the ways in which they functioned as claiming rights, claiming rights in the sense of claiming rights to particular geographic areas, but also something you said and didn't elaborate on, claiming rights to speech on their own, right? So that these were not just claiming rights external to the product, the artifact, but also the text within the artifact has its own claim of right to it as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you've hit on an interesting point. They both claim territory and natural resources that come from particular territories and sort of map those landscapes, but they're also mnemonic devices. So when they're displayed, and they're really an interesting distinction between the kitsaxuthum, the add cedarboard screens, and even the petroglyphs beforehand, and the tlitzapitlum, which came later because they're mobile, is that kitsaxuthum were displayed in ma'as, big houses, and they were always on display, whereas tlitzapitlum were then reserved for display only during times of sacred ceremony. So there's a transition that happens in terms of the meaning. So now, when they're displayed only at these moments of ceremony, potlatch ceremonies, and these potlatches, I mean, today they go on for at least 12 hours, but more likely 24 to 48. Historically, they could have gone on for 28 days, moon cycle. But when the tlitzapitlum is brought out, they enable these long oratory sessions in which families explain not only what territories they come from, territories that perhaps women who have been married into their family have come from, different rights that come through those relationships, whether it's to different names, family stories and histories are explicated in this process. There are images, again, that are mnemonic, so they'll trigger the remembering of a story, and this is really important when you don't have written history. It's an oral history system. And so they function to enable that oral history and the ongoing telling and remembering and memory that happens in these spaces. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of elaborating on the function of them beyond but beyond the claims that they declare, the declarations that they make about territory and natural resources, which are really important, obviously, today in terms of people's livelihoods and the ongoing experience of dispossession of land and territory and all of the profit that's been made by others from their territories.
I had a question for Jilly about if you could say a little bit more about the design sensing. Which I was tempted by that phrasing.
Well, this emerged out of two writings that I was engaged with recently. One was Claudia's thesis about the vegan flan making, which I was her advisor. So we had a lot of conversations on how did she iterate to produce a better version of this flan. So we realized that as what she was based on was not necessarily only thinking, oh, I'm going to use this material, this and that, but as she was recording herself, she was finding that she would smell things, she would touch things. Most of her judgments were made out of her direct visceral interaction with the things she was making. And this came out of the material she brought as she was doing this self-study. It was self-ethnography. Autoethnography. And at the same time, very recently, I started reading a lot of literature on repair, and there was a very interesting text about two men working together in fixing a car, and they were recording the dialogues, but also, I think, recording the sounds that they were making as they were working very physically with their body in doing this work. And one of the results of the outcomes of this in this paper was that sensual knowledge is one of the main things that is worked through the processes of care or repair, especially this kind of collaboration between people and the object they do. And I think this is something maybe we disregard especially when we're thinking of design thinking as being the main kind of template through which design emerges as a process. And maybe there is some attention to be given to this particular internal function of designing. So.
Thank you. For Selwyn, I have a very quick comment. Years ago in the late 1980s, I worked for a nonprofit that decided that they had to become a bathroom accessible for differently abled people, and also they had to build a ramp because they just had a staircase. And the fundraiser complained to the boss that the people she had to raise money for this, and she said the people who were donors who had money who were disabled, she said what they really wanted at the time was to be able to go from one street to the sidewalk. That was before we had the curb cuts. So I don't remember if she contacted elected officials or anything or to try to put her 2 cents about that. But that was before we had the curb cuts, which now we can't live. Now none of us can live without. And I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, we're talking about Selwyn Goldsmith and the unisex bathroom. I haven't done any background research on this, but I know in the school where I teach, the now gender neutral bathrooms are simply our old disabled accessible bathrooms that have been relabeled. And I've wondered often if that's actually the case elsewhere too, because that would make an interesting study of this question of disabled access kind of bleeding into another social area of empowerment and assertion of rights too. Of course, those were created because of civil rights laws. That is all the ADA is civil rights law.
Also, just it was sort of mentioned just that it was so many the bathrooms were redone so many times. As she said, the rules changed, and there would be a bathroom accommodating disabled, and then it was. There would be a bathroom made accommodating disabled at this nonprofit, and then it was done over 2 or 3 more times to make it bigger and better each time and all that.
Did anybody go to the opening of PS 122? Actually, I was horrified.
when you walk in, there's like 5 urinals in use. And then there's the bathrooms, and there's no, tampons or Kotex. To me, it's not an everything bathroom. To me, it just looked like a men's bathroom, basically, especially in the throes of a wild party, which was the opening party. They renovated. We're the ones that, me and my friends, we were the ones that took the building back in the days. And I don't know. I just don't feel good about it. People who have bathrooms when you walk in, and then there's a lot of rooms with bathrooms, I think that's great. If transgenders say they feel uncomfortable and they want a private bathroom, I don't see why it's so hard to understand that I'm a woman and I don't necessarily want to walk into a bathroom with 5 urinals in use by men who some of them are straight. So, But if you want to see what they have new in mind, go check out 122, the top space, because I think Melba Mines and a few other things are still in that building as well.
Yeah, I don't want to go on and on about bathrooms, but I will just put in one more point. Sylvan Goldsmith, who I was speaking about, was actually the first person to do a study also of why he noticed that his wife was always so late coming back during the intermission to theater performances, and then they realized that the women's rooms always had these really long lines. He actually did a study of it, and I think it made its way into the press eventually because we started talking about that in the late 1970s, and that was exactly because of his research on that. So he also extended this study of disability into these gendered issues too.
Thank you. So let's just have one more question, Karma, or one or two.
So my question's also for Elizabeth. Sorry, we're on the bathroom thing. And yes, there are always lines at the ladies' rooms. I hate New York, actually, because of that and because of the subway stairs. Anyway, but I was looking, so like what am I doing on my laptop? I'm taking notes, but also I was looking up the 1961 American Standards Association document because I was like, so standards meaning voluntary industry standards, or like what kind of standards are we talking about? Okay, yeah, they're voluntary industry standards, and they make very clear in the preamble that, yeah, they're not going to like sanction anyone, even among the member organizations, that doesn't follow them. So I have 2 hard questions that you probably can't answer, but I'm just going to ask in case you can. One is, do you have any sense of like whether anybody followed any of these standards? And secondly, because they were voluntary. And secondly, I was trying to find images from Henry Dreyfuss's Designing for People. I don't think that I think Measure of Man and Woman later has like the grips and things and the wheelchair, but I'm trying to figure out which date that is. I think it's later. Mets, yeah.
So Karma is asking me a question just to give you guys a little bit of background on it. So Karma is making a really subtle distinction here, which is I was talking about the American Standards Initiative that Tim Nugent had actually developed. And the reason why she was asking me about that really specifically is that a lot of the time, these kinds of standards will be set by business to do it before government comes along. So there's something in the air where they know that there's going to be change that's being made. So they try to get out ahead of that and tailor the discourse in a way so it meets their own needs. And that was indeed exactly the case with this when I was describing to you what the standards were and how they were shaped, because that was done at the University of Illinois. Some of it was actually industry funded, his research as well. But just to be clear, and I want you should think about this a little bit because of the implications. So that though did Karma become our standard. That is then that work pretty clearly rolls over first into a bunch of local and state laws, and then it gets really codified in 1968 with the Barrier-Free Architecture Act, which is the first of a series of civil rights laws that cover people with disability, and eventually feeds into the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. So it does what was set by a bunch of businesses who were worried did become basically American law. I can't speak to, though, whether Dreyfus deals with those issues or not. Yeah, at that time.
Thank you.
Hi. One of the great unruly design which we see is, you see these kids wearing this very wide, very, pant legs and, drooling sort of jeans. You must have all seen it. Now, the origin of that is actually in the curb cuts and the accessible bathrooms, because we have wheelchairs. You know, you can take it anywhere. You know, you can take it in the building, you can take it in the school, in the elevator, everywhere. The sidewalks and the curbs are actually designed so that you can use a wheel. So the rollerblades and the skateboards and all of that, so all of the young people and the design and the fashion actually followed that. Another very interesting thing about the curb is it also defines the building height. You know, legally, like, you know, bathrooms are actually not something which is in the design realm. It's ADA, which is the law. So it's the judge who's ruling. It's not the architect and the engineer. But when it comes to the building departments and design, you know, it's actually the height is measured from that curb, you know, whether that's going to be 60 feet or 120 feet. So this is kind of an interesting thing, like, you know, how design gets really wild, you know, by something which is so technical and so legal. And my question is, quickly, like, if you can think of something which is completely wild and unruly in terms of design.
Thank you very much, the presenters. That's great.